e4. King's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. e5. King's pawn game, opening line. Black responds symmetrically, making a direct challenge to the central squares. Knight f3. King's knight opening, opening line. With the possible exception of 2f4, this is the most logical second move against Black's symmetrical answer to the king pawn. The knight attacks e5, clears the way for an eventual castle, and rests on its best defensive square. Knight c6. Queen's knight variation, opening line. Now, when white plays 3 knight c3 instead of the Ruy Lopez, it's the three knights game, a leisurely system. Bishop b5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, opening line. This is the Ruy Lopez move. It is designed to maintain long-term pressure on Black's center. If driven away, the king's bishop will take up a position at b3 or c2 to focus on a kingside attack or on the central squares. Knight f6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, opening line. The Berlin defense was common at the turn of the century at the highest levels of play. The intent is to take advantage of the exposed position of the white bishop in some variations, but it usually leads to cramped positions in which white has more options. Castle kingside. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, opening line. Knight takes e4. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d4. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight d6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Too greedy is 5 e takes d4, 6 rook e1, when white is on top. Bishop takes c6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d takes c6. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. d takes e5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight f5. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Queen takes d8, check. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. King takes d8. Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, opening line. Knight c3. Out of opening book. Rook d1. Check. Would have been in the Ruy Lopez Spanish, Berlin defense, open variation, book opening. King e8. h3. h5. Bishop f4. Bishop e7. Rook a d1. Takes control of the open file. Bishop e6. Blocks white's pawn at e5. Knight e4. Rook d8. b3. Protects white's pawn at a2. Rook takes d1. Rook takes d1. White wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Bishop d5. Attacks white's knight at e4. Rook e1 removes the threat on white's knight at e4. h4. Knight f6 check checks black's king and blocks black's pawn at f7. G takes f6 protects black's king. E takes f6 pins black's bishop at e7 and forks black's bishop at e7 and black's pawn at c7. Bishop takes f3, blocks white's pawn at f2. G takes f3. Black wins 2 knights, for a bishop and a pawn. Rook g8 check removes the threat on black's pawn at c7 and black's bishop and checks white's king. King f1 moves it out of check and forks black's bishop and black's pawn at c7. Rook g6 attacks white's pawn at f6. F takes e7 creates a passed pawn on e7. White wins a bishop. Knight d4 forks white's pawn at f3 and white's pawn at c2. Rook e4 attacks black's knight. Knight takes f3 blocks white's pawn at f2. Black wins a pawn. Material is even. Bishop e3 attacks black's pawn at a7. Rook f6. King e2. Knight g1 check removes the threat on black's pawn at a7 and forks white's pawn at h3 and white's king. King f1 moves it out of check and triple forks black's pawn at h4, black's pawn at a7, and black's knight. Knight f3 moves it to safety, removes the threat on black's pawn at h4, and blocks white's pawn at f2. c3. a6 moves it to safety. King e2. Knight g1 check forks white's pawn at h3 and white's king. King f1 moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at h4 and black's knight. Knight f3 moves it to safety, protects black's pawn at h4 and blocks white's pawn at f2. King e2. Knight g1 check forks white's pawn at h3 and white's king. King f1 moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at h4 and black's knight. Knight f3 moves it to safety, protects black's pawn at h4 and blocks white's pawn at f2. The game ends in a draw. Thinking. The chess master recommends king to e1. You move your king to e1, which moves it out of check and attacks black's pawn at h4. Black counters with the knight to f3, which protects black's pawn at h4, checks your king, and blocks your pawn at f2. You move your king to f1, which moves it out of check. Black responds by moving rook to e6, which forks your pawn at e7 and your rook and places it behind the passed pawn at e7. You move your rook to f4, which moves it to safety and attacks black's knight. Black replies by moving knight to e5, which moves it to safety. You move your rook to b4, which attacks black's pawn at b7. Black responds with the pawn to b6, which moves it out of harm's way. Your rook takes pawn at h4, which creates a passed pawn on h3. Black answers with king takes pawn, which isolates your pawn at f2. You move your bishop to g5, which checks black's king. Black counters with the pawn to f6, which removes the threat on black's king and attacks your bishop. You move your rook to h7, which protects your bishop and checks black's king. Black responds by moving the king to d6, which moves it out of check and attacks your bishop. You move your bishop to f4, which moves it to safety and pins black's knight. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a pawn for a pawn. In addition, the pressure on black's king is increased, and the pressure on your king is somewhat decreased. King f1 moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at h4 and black's knight. Knight f3 moves it to safety, protects black's pawn at h4, and blocks white's pawn at f2. The game ends in a draw.